Research Methods in Personality Psychology, Part 4, Test Data. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Test data is the topic of this unit in our discussion of the four sources of data. And it probably is the best kind of data, in my opinion. It's collected under the most controlled circumstances. Although in your textbook, Larson and Buss have a far more broader construal of test data than, to be honest, David Buss taught me. But let's go with their version because it does capture a lot of very useful things. So test data can be information provided by standardized tests and standardized testing situations. And the benefit of that is if you put individuals in the same situation, give them the same test, you can find out if they're going to behave differently, if you're going to get some nice individual differences there. So test data may be used to elicit situations that are indicators of personality. And we don't have to infer that personality is operating. Let me tell you about one of my favorite little experiments. This would be test data for extroversion introversion. You pre-screen individuals on a standardized test for extroversion introversion. Place them into a small room. This experiment's been done a couple of ways. One with a dimmer switch on lights in the room. The other on a volume knob on a radio. Bring individuals into the room, give them some busy work task, and then have them adjust the lighter volume to their favorite spots. Introverts, you would imagine, like more subdued light and quieter music. Extroverts like louder music, brighter lights. Same situation, individuals behave differently. The limitations on using test data in that context is that sometimes people try to guess what you're doing. Every intro psych student thinks that every study that they're going to participate in is a deception study, and they're usually disappointed when they're not. You have to make sure your participants are interpreting the same information the same way the experimenter intended them to perceive it. And researchers may influence how participants behave. You might get unintentional effects of experimenters who are too nice or maybe not nice enough that affect how the individual performs during the test. This is why for standardized tests, if you've ever taken a standardized achievement test, for example, in K through 12, you're read the instructions in an extremely monotonic way. Tests are presented to each individual the same. You don't want to have undue influences of the administrator. Could you imagine an instance where the administrator comes in and says, "This is the hardest test you'll ever take. Very few people ever pass it, blah, 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 blah." You're going to put your subjects in a depressed, nasty mood. If on the other hand, you have an experimenter comes in and say, "Wow, I bet you're going to do really good on this task. It's really fun. You should have a great time doing it." Your participants are going to act differently. So you have to watch out for all of those forms of potential contamination in your study. There are limitations to using test data. First one is your participants may try to figure out what you're doing and outguess you. when you use intro psych students, we call them Psych 10 students on our campus, as our primary participant pool. They've had a research methods unit, and they get told about deception studies, they get told about different kinds of studies, and being curious, some of them will try to figure out what you're doing, which may sabotage your results because they're playing around with trying to figure out your study rather than completing the task. A second point is you have to make sure that your participants are doing what you intend them to do in terms of the manipulation. If they're not, you might have serious flaws in your data. So you have to make sure that they're doing things not the way you want them to, but as the research design intends them to do. And you have to be careful with researchers because sometimes research assistants may influence how participants complete their task. If you have participants walk in and you have a very upbeat experimenter who's really positive and energetic, it's going to possibly influence ratings as opposed to someone who comes in kind of very Eeyore-esque, the sad donkey from Winnie the Pooh, and talks about how hard it all is going to be to do this task and stuff like that. So you have to be careful to not unintentionally mess up your results by having researchers influence participants' results unduly. Another form of test data, got to get to move the mouse here, excuse me, here we go, is to use some kind of mechanical device. Mechanical devices are great because they're not hampered by human biases. They'll record what's there, and they're not going to make a mistake unless the machine's miscalibrated. You can possibly use them in the field or naturalistic settings. The problem is they're kind of hard to theoretically use and tap into theoretical constructs, although it can and has been done. For example, Ed Diener, who is one of the foremost researchers in happiness, has done beeper studies where he randomly beeped people in Chicago and looked at how happy they were, and then looked at the weather and found out that when the weather was nice, people were happier. The second author of your textbook, David Buss, when he was a young graduate student, did a study with something he called an actometer. Basically, it was a pedometer, and he was looking to see if children that behaved a lot would get more what he called upper limit control from teachers, parents, and caregivers than those kids that didn't. So he put a simple pedometer watch on the wrist of the children at a daycare center. And he was going to look at how many clicks on the pedometer each student had made and compare it to how many times they had been told to sit down, be quiet, behave themselves, other things like that. Well, here's where you get some of the stuff we were talking about in the previous slide on unintentional consequences. Because as Buss started to observe what the kids were doing, he found the kids were sitting there doing this. Not waving, but looking at the pedometer and moving their wrist back and forth because they saw the little thing was clicking off every time they moved. And you give a 5-year-old that kind of little piece of hardware, and what are they going to do? They're going to sit there and go like this. And they were having a great time. The problem is it messed up bus's results considerably. So I had to throw the data away, start all over again. And the very high-tech solution at the time was to simply use masking tape to cover the lens of the actometer. And then things went well, and he did prove his hypothesis. Very cool little study. Test data subsumes physiological data, where we can measure an individual's arousal, how they react to stimuli, things that might be indicators of personality traits. When we get to the biology of personality traits, we'll talk about how extroverts, for example, have faster nervous systems than, introverts have faster nervous systems than extroverts do, and they're more reactive. And people have studied these things using physiological data. When we get to the evolution unit, we'll talk about a study David Buss and Randy Larson, the authors of your textbook, did with several other people on sexual jealousy. And they hooked people up to a bunch of physiological markers and induced jealousy, and found out that when you made people jealous, their physiology changed. There's some cool things about physiological data. It's hard to fake. It's hard to fake increase in heart rates. It's hard to fake increase in galvanic spin response. It can be done, but usually there's no motivation for the participants to do that. Disadvantages for physiological data. It's often in a very contrived artificial lab setting, and you also have to make sure that the participant perceives the situation as the experimenter intended it to be intended it to be. Sorry. I was thinking one step ahead at an example I frequently use. Mary Roach, who is a popular science writer, wrote a tremendous book on human sexuality called Bonk. And she talks about some studies done on female orgasm in the brain, where women volunteered to manipulate themselves to orgasm in a fMRI machine, and the researchers then were going to assess how the brain changes during female orgasm. Well, it's hard to find participants who, one, will participate in the study, two, can bring themselves to orgasm in front of researchers, and while they have half their body stuck in an fMRI machine. But they were able to do it with several women and found some interesting changes in physiology. But it might be limited to those women who can do that task under those situations. It's probably my most extreme example of physiological data collection. Well, also included under test data is projective test. Here we have a cartoon, and the guy's saying it looks like someone tried to pronounce Rorschach with a mouthful of soup and spit it up and made an ambiguous picture. And you've probably all heard of the Rorschach test. It's one of the things that non-scientists and non-psychologists kind of slap in the face that a lot of people use projective test. I was introduced to projective test as a graduate student. I worked with the late, great Jack Atkinson of Achievement Motivation fame, and was one of his last teaching assistants before he fully retired. And we would administer TAT test in the classroom as examples of different aspects of his motivational theory. It was kind of cool stuff, and it kind of taught me the value of projectives. There is something to them. Although I don't use them in my work, I do see them, if done right, as a valuable way to collect data on things that are hard to assess by paper and pencil. For example, Atkinson always said that it's really impossible to measure motivation with a paper and pencil test because everybody's going to say they're highly motivated if you have a question that says motivated or not motivated. So he and his colleagues found that the TAT was a far better way of tapping into motives than other means. So let's talk about projective test a little bit. Basically, you present an ambiguous stimuli and you ask someone to describe what they see. And the notion is they'll project things about their personality, or at least what they're thinking of, into the ambiguous stimuli. And if you were to study Rorschach test, you'd find that there is a very rigid scoring system, and you get points for seeing this in a picture, or that, or a picture, or other things. And it's things like movement, color, fluidity, stuff like that. With what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the thematic apperception test, which are a series of ambiguous pictures that people project things onto. This can be administered either individually by a clinician, and they've been used for clinical work, or it can be used in group research using some guided instructions. That's the form I'm going to talk to you about. Atkinson and McClelland validated the thematic apperception test in an interesting way. They went to New London, Connecticut shortly after the Second World War ended and went to a submarine training base. And they got permission from the commander of the base to do this little study. They had a control and an experimental group. The control group were a group of sailors who just went through their normal task during the day. Then right before they went to lunch, they took a thematic apperception test. The experimental group had an interesting manipulation. Now, I've never served in the military. I appreciate those who have. And one thing I do know about the military is they get up really, really early. So the sailors in the experimental group were allowed to sleep in the morning of the experiment. Big treat if you got to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. The only thing is, by sleeping in, they missed breakfast. So they slept in, didn't get their breakfast, but went about their morning task, took a TAT test right before lunch. And you're already probably have your wheels turning and are saying, yeah, what happened? The TAT stories for the sailors in the experimental group had significantly more imagery about food, being hungry, things like that, than the stories generated by the sailors in the control group. Now, virtually anything can be a TAT picture. Most TAT pictures are extremely fuzzy. So I found this one, and I'm showing it to you mainly because it can project on a screen. It's a need for power picture. I've been using it for a while in class, and I typically have students create a story from this picture. So here's the picture. In a TAT story, what you would do is you would have your participants in the study look at the picture for a minute and study the scene, and then they would have to write a story about what's going on in this picture. And the picture's fairly ambiguous. You can project all kinds of different things into it. And I'll tell you, once we go through the 4 points, some of the stories that we typically get for this picture in class. So let's look at this picture. You'd get a minute to stare at it and figure out a story. And then you would get these 4 prompts. And each one of these prompts would have a minute of time for you to write a few sentences. You're not going to write a Tolstoy novel doing this. And it kind of guides you through story writing here. So the first question: what is being thought? What is wanted by whom? So let's take a look at this TAT picture. And as we go through, I'll tell you some of the stories that have been generated in class about these two people here. Now, if you look, the picture's really ambiguous. It's also a very, very old picture, so you might get some historical stylings there. Basically, the picture is you have a guy lying on a bed. You have a woman who is covering her face and holding on to, it looks like, the doorknob to the door. There's a window, there's kind of a indiscreet wall. And it doesn't really give you any clue to what is going on. What you need to do is project into the story what you believe is going on there. So let's look at these 4 different questions. First, what is happening? Who are these people? Well, I've gotten a wide variety of stories. So you get some deep, dark ones like she's just murdered him and now she's got remorseful and she's upset. You get he's drunk, passed out in bed. He had a fight with her and she's very angry. You also get kind of more amusing ones. You get, I've gotten from several students that, well, the 2 of them are very stoned. He's so stoned he's passed out on the bed. She's laughing with her hand over her face as she wanders around stoned in the house. Of course, the deepest, darkest ones are I mentioned the murder one already, sorry. Sorry, wrong button. Second point. What has led up to this question? What has happened in the past? Well, you can imagine with the scenarios I gave you a second ago, what the answers would be to this question. With the illness one, it's been a long illness, it's been very stressful. With the murder one, he's done something like cheated on her or done something so extreme that she's murdered him. With the stoner one, it's just that they've been out partying and come home and continue partying, and now he passed out and she's laughing hysterically behind her hand and has the munchies. With the illness one, it could be he's finally succumbed to a very long-term illness and she's broken down. You really can't tell, and there isn't a right or wrong in these stories. Third question, what is being thought? What is wanted by whom? Well, with the guy being passed out, sick or dead, not a whole lot he's probably thinking about. With her, it's either relief, she's too high to worry about anything, she's sad she's finally lost her partner, and things like that. Then you have the final question. What will happen? What will be done? Typically, if it's the stoner funny story, she'll lie down next to him and pass out, and they'll both wake up with really bad hangovers. If she's murdered him, she might have to go to prison and suffer for her crime. Or in other versions of the story, she runs away and gets away with it. With the diseased one, where he's sick and dies, she becomes a widow and then has to eventually move on with her life and pick herself up and move on. So you can see that there could be hundreds and hundreds of variants to these stories. When you're using standard TAT methods, there are set scoring systems where trained scorers go in and give a point or not a point for something. For achievement, there's a 11-point scale. I'm not sure about the other scoring metrics for the other scales, but it's an interesting way of looking at personality characteristics. It really works well for need for power, which is basically what this picture is used for. My favorite TAT picture shows two guys standing by a machine and looking over what's on the machine bed. And you get all kinds of stories from they're the Wright brothers and they're about to finish the first airplane, to the guy's messed his machine up for the last time and his foreman's very angry and about to fire him. I'd use that picture, but it's so fuzzy that you can't make anything out of it. It doesn't really scan well. So you're stuck with this one. So let's finally look at projective test. And the strengths of projective test are that you can find out things about wishes, desires, and fantasies that a person may not even be aware of at a conscious level when he's reporting them. The problem is finding a good scoring system that is indeed valid. Sometimes TAT and other projective work have given dubious results, and validity and reliabilities generally are on the low side. And one of the other consequences is if you go too crazy with your ink blots, it can mess your life up in some interesting ways, as it did for our little picture of Rorschach here. So test data, you can see, is broadly construed to represent any kind of data collection where we're manipulating individuals to try to get at their personality processes. In our next unit on data sources, we'll talk about the most frequently used source of data, the good old self-report. See you next time on Personality Psychology. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020. Professor Michael Montwin. All rights reserved. Bye now.